Nicho nichanam chetanas chetananam eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman tamatmastam ye nupashanti deraha tesham shanti shashvati netaresham. Om shantihi shantihi shantihi. That one, the eternal among non-eternal things, the intelligence of the most intelligent ones, who, though ever one, nevertheless fulfills the desires of the many. That one, the wise beings realize as dwelling in their own self. To them belong peace and to none else. Om peace, peace, peace. Om yato dipo nivataste nengate sopamashmrita. Yogino yatachitasya yunjato yogan atmanaha. Om shantihi shantihi shantihi. Like a candle in a windless place, its flame steady and unflickering, so too is the mind of the enlightened one, dwelling within upon the Atman and steeped in yoga. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karvo Vahai, Tejasvi Navaditamastu Ma Vidvishovahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman, the reality, protect us. May Brahman sustain us. May Brahman illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. Having encountered our traditional opening with Sanskrit slokas from the Upanishads and the Gita, then we move into our second class in this series, because last week we were absent. So we've had 1 week break. I hope you all studied the first week's teachings. I know I looked back on them because with the week absence in between, I wanted to be able to pick up where we left off. It's always good, though, to have a little bit of a refresher, and since the title of the class was Negligence of Brahman and Shankara's Doorways to Yoga, those are the two charts I've left up here for us to review. And we will then move on to a sort of comparison, historically speaking, of Shankara, who is around 700 AD, and the father of yoga. He's called Patanjali in about 140 AD, and one of them being the teacher of the other in another lifetime. A very interesting situation that we come upon in terms of Shankara, Gaudapada, and Patanjali, showing not only are these beings one and of the same consciousness and same minds, but that the philosophies that they teach, i.e. Vedanta and yoga, are also considered to be interconnected, intrinsically intertwined, and throughout the ages have been, as Krishna says in the Gita, like pearls strung on a single string, have always been there, available to people who have that dharmic leaning, that is, dharmis. They're a bit difficult to find in the world. I think they are rare. There are a lot of people who follow conventional religious ways, which is a sort of once a week practice, But the dharmis are people who look into the teachings day by day and try and work them into their life in a very transformative way. Basically, you can have observances, but if you don't work them into your life via what we call sadhana, or spiritual practice, which is a combination of meditating each day upon ultimate reality without form or beyond form, and also having your devotions towards God with form. That's called Brahman and Ishvara, by the way, two ways of seeing God, as the ultimate transcendental reality and as God with form, who takes on cosmic form and also appears on earth as avatars or divine incarnations or prophets and messengers, gurus, throughout the many centuries and millennia. But then you also need to be practicing your studies, your swadhyaya, which is listed in these charts that we're looking at, and follow that all up with service to God and human beings. Sometimes you say, well, we must serve all beings as God, but Swami Vivekananda was pretty clear that better to serve God and all beings. He was always making turns of phrase like that. There's no God in the world, but the world is in God, for instance. So if you make this 2% shift we often talk about of consciousness, or if you turn the whole thing on its ear, turn Maya on its ear and look at it from an opposite direction, then you can afford yourself a much cleaner and clearer perspective, which Shankara and Patanjali were both well known for, their clear minds, lucid minds. Sometimes Ramakrishna would say that in spiritual life, the key fits into the lock and the lock turns in the opposite way than you'd usually think. So in conventional ways, you expect things to happen in a certain way, but in spiritual life, you have to do things sometimes opposite of what it appears, especially in terms of mundane human convention. For instance, I was speaking of observances. So one of the observances in yoga is nonviolence. You could mate that up with one of the commandments, thou shalt not kill. But if you look at ahimsa or nonviolence as being a daily observance, then you're going to have to observe that in terms of your relationship with all kinds of living beings, insects, animals, human beings in other countries, your ancestors who have departed and those who are coming back into the womb in the form of rebirth, taking birth with you in your families. All of that has to be observed in a nonviolent way as far as possible in a physical world, where war is rather a fact of existence. But if war just becomes a way that you make a living, then of course you have to inspect your actions and see if you're transgressing the Dharma in your operations as a society, as a politics, as a military, and so forth. You have to ensure that your intentions are not skewed and they're correct, and that violence is, if you must, a final option or last resort that you would have to resort to only in terms of protecting yourself. So Buddhism, Jainism, and Vedanta, Hinduism in general, has always been very nonviolent in their approach to things and in their maintenance of day-to-day observances. And that would reflect in how you treat your environment, because that's basically plants, forests, the insects that occupy them, the small creatures that also are there. That's a relationship you have to maintain too, to not only observe nonviolence, but also be free of karma that accrues through killing, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And then, of course, your relationships with other people, not only verbally or in act, but also in thought. So thought, word, and deed is the expression there that we try and remain balanced in yoga. That's why I chanted, like a candle in a windless place. Its flame always steady and unflickering. The mind of the yogi is stable and unswerving like that too, never deviating from those great principles called yamas and niyamas. We'll look a little bit at that today because it's in a part of the stairways to yoga as we ascend it. But again, as a reminder to the class a week ago and as a precursor to classes that are coming up in the next 3 Sundays, because I think this is a 5-class series we'll be here with you. So, of course, all of these classes will end up on YouTube and SRV and also on Advaita Academy. So these are things that you can review so that Swadhyaya, your teachings, can be kept fresh in your mind constantly, as is sometimes difficult if you're far away without a guru nearby, without a teacher, and you don't have a Buddhist center or Vedanta center or some center nearby where you can go and take teachings. Then it's good to review these teachings online and refresh your mind even daily to these principles, because many things stick in the mind, we know. Some of them not always so desirable, some of them not very healthy. And the ones that are healthy and are beneficial are the ones that are the hardest to stick. Sort of like snow trying to fall on wet ground. It melts right away. So we have to dry up the ground of our consciousness so these Dharma teachings, these beautiful white flakes of wisdom that come falling out of the inner skies, can stick and mount and build up to beautiful background of teachings that we can always draw on, and that they fill our minds day to day. It's very important. It's a way out of brooding, it's a way out of fear, it's a way out of darkness, it's a way out of ignorance, and it's a way out of doubt. All these things which make up the curtain of nescience, which is the backdrop of people's consciousness, and out of which they're drawing a lot of their karmas, and those karmas working themselves into new actions. We'll look at that too today and next week in terms of the nidanas of yoga. The nidanas of Buddhism, and how these are links in a chain over 3 lifetimes, they say, in some schools of Buddhism. So you might say, as a synopsis of what's happening in this class series, we're looking at Shankara's teachings side by side by Patanjali's yoga, and side by side by Lord Buddha's teachings on Buddhism, particularly those teachings that have to do with 4 Noble Truths and the nidanas, the links of karma in the 3 lifetimes. Those will be placed side by side, sort of a triputi of their own. If I had 3 stands here, I could have 3 charts on each of them, and we could just go back and forth between them easily. Well, you have to come to a retreat, one of our SRB retreats for that, or a weekend of classes, and join us anytime. You're welcome. And so if you are looking on now, you see that we looked at both of these last week, and the Negligence of Brahman chart is a quick study, so we didn't spend a lot of time on it. Suffice to say that in the Viveka Chudamani, that is Shankara's crest jewel of discrimination. Even in English, the title is very inspiring and also very powerful. The crest jewel of discrimination. So you must have discrimination between what is abiding and what's non-abiding, or what's eternal and non-eternal. And that's a part of your practice as a spiritual aspirant. One of the great moves in life that moves you from conventional religious means to daily dharma, so that you're a dharmi, a person who practices dharma all the time. So one of the things that would do that for you would be contemplating these teachings all the time and keeping them in mind. So that's part of the process called yukti, or sometimes called shravana, hearing the truth, but then you have to follow it through with manana, or rolling it over in your mind. That would be more like what you do every day to remind yourself of these teachings. Remind the mind, or as we say sometimes, don't forget to remember the divine reality that's lying behind everything, behind the appearance of things. Appearance of things is often pleasant, and sometimes it's not so pleasant, depending on how balanced you can keep your mind. But if you remain indifferent to both the pleasant and the unpleasant, or the good and the bad, then you can maintain balance, called yoga, which is what Patanjali is talking about here, and what Shankara is also bringing forward. So again, as a sort of reminder, Patanjali was there in one of his lifetimes, the lifetime that he constructed the 8-limbed yoga called Ashtanga or Patanjala, sometimes called Raja Yoga. Those are all names for 8 limbs of yoga, not just the physical yoga, which has got its place but is far, far subservient and lower than having all 8 limbs or all levels of yoga in mind and practicing them constantly, all the way up to the yoga of meditation. And also, as I was saying 2 weeks ago, not just jumping from a physical posture to a high state of meditation without satisfying the limbs in between. Limbs in between would be practicing these observances and these daily sadhanas, and then watching your mind to keep it from deviating, pratyahara, keep it from falling, keep it from attaching to objects and becoming obsessed with senses and sense objects. And then focusing your mind in concentration and meditation, those are all things that are the inner stuff of yoga, not just sitting and then jumping to meditation and hoping that that's going to be enough. Not just jumping to the highest step, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, but knowing the steps in between is very important, and in my opinion, as a Dharma teacher for decades here in the West, and also going to India, one of the things that's missing in our ideology and in our present assessment and understanding of great systems like the 8-limbed yoga is that we need to be practicing all of these limbs intensely as you would practice your physical postures, or more so. You'd be putting as much attention or more attention on that. In fact, if you take Shankara's, we might even come across this in one of the charts, it says that if you just shift your body to many postures all the time, then you build asana vasana, the desire to do that in your mind. Asana vasana manasana, if you want to call it that. It's a posture of just shifting postures, but Shankara even mentions ekasana is what you want. Eka in Sanskrit means one, so if you can just sit like this for a long time, like I will do for you today for 3 hours, and forget the body and just put your consciousness and you raise your prana up into your, to your senses, and your senses in, just like we looked at 2 weeks ago. It senses into the word, and the word then into your thought, and the thought into the ego, and ripen the ego and take it back. That you're practicing this every day, then the involution path comes open to you, and the evolution path comes clear to you. Then you know why you took a body, and how to get out of the body, and how to take another body if you should so desire. It's really very simple when you put it into words like that, when you can conclude it like that after some 40 or 50 years of practice, or over many lifetimes maybe. But to actually do it after you've fallen is the problem. If you've fallen out of yoga, or out of equilibrium, or out of balance, or your mind is not in peace, you're not in harmony with yourself and with your family and with your friends and with your other countries, that's when it becomes a problem to try and regain that equilibrium. And that's when yoga becomes a practice instead of a principle. It should be a principle that everyone should just be dwelling in. But instead, now it becomes a practice. And then if the practice itself falls into just a physical observance only, then it's not going to reach these deeper levels of purification of senses and mind that Shankara is talking about here. Let's run over these real quick. First of all, you should know that we should not neglect reality. We call it Brahman. Those of you who are looking on live streaming, welcome, by the way, and all of us that have gathered here in the room, the many here in our ashram in Hawaii, and those who we can't see, who are also, we think, gathered around us in their subtle bodies, looking in and looking out from inside. We don't be put off by the word Brahman. You could call it Allah, or you could call it Almighty Father, or the Great Spirit, or anything you like. It's this undeniable existence with a capital E, which is, of course, your very existence, and the existence of all beings, and the existence of all the great ones, too. It's just non-dual reality, and without it, nothing would be here. And so it's unmanifest, and it's also manifest, as Krishna says in the Gita. And it's also supremely unmanifest, beyond both form and formlessness as well. Because when you get into formlessness that you can gain by sitting here in one posture and then going into meditation without knowing the steps in between, like say how you wake and dream and go into deep sleep and come back to dream and go into waking, if you just do that by habit without knowing how your consciousness is shifting, then you'll begin to fall into this conventional way of living, and also you'll lose some of the wonder of your own existence, and things will become boring, and things will become undesirable, and people will get tired of their lives, and they won't find the meaning in their life, and those kinds of complaints that we hear from people. They'll become suicidal, or they'll try and turn to intoxicants or medicines and so forth, and try all sorts of things to try and get themselves back to balance, which is their true nature. So to observe the presence of Brahman, whatever you might call it, as I was saying, would be part of your daily practice as a Vedantist, or say as a Buddhist mindfulness practice that they talk about. So that's very important. So the opposite of that would be neglecting it. So here you see that if you're starting with your mind and you see that there's the bouncing ball of the mind, it's not really settled at the top step, and maybe even mounting higher, then it begins to brood on sense objects. And according to Shankara and father of yoga, because he said about 140 AD that he said the yoga now, I'm paraphrasing from the Yoga Sutras, yoga has become, the yogi has become attached to outer things in this age, or the seer is attached to the seen, if you want to put it very simply. And so now the seen is in control, that which is seen, that means, or scenes, either way you want to put it. Outer things have become in control of the seer himself or herself, and so they've forgotten that all of these things come out of their mind. How about all of this is mind, it's not God? It's one thing to consider. We say, oh, all of this is God. Oh, you can't say that unless you're at a very, very high state of awareness that you have transcended all of this, and it's not in the picture anymore for you. That's called samadhi. And both of these great beings were known for that. On this side, Shankara, nirvikalpa. On this side, Patanjali, asampragyata. Seedless samadhi, or a samadhi that's beyond time, you see. So they were known for those kinds of samadhis. So then they should be the ones, of course, that we're listening to in that regard. So the seer has become attached to the seen, Patanjali said. Here, Shankara takes the same stance. He says, brooding on sense objects causes the mind to fall into thirst for enjoyment, as if enjoyment is some mode of existence that's a way out. As if enjoyment is, you can have it without having a negative reaction. Good and bad, pleasure and pain, virtue and vice. You see, people might get into a mode of having good things happen to them, a cycle, and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, bad things start happening to them. And they don't have the long view, the long inner view into the past to know that these two are connected. that's twofold problem. One is that now you've fallen into bad times, as they say, and you've forgotten all the good things that happened to you. At the same time, you're forgetting that this bad time will pass, and all the good things will come back. Actually, that's one of the tricks of yoga that I can teach my students. Is I see them after a couple months, and they say, "Oh, I was so blissful last time you saw me. Everything was going so well, but what happened?" And I said, "Just wait. See, all that balance will come back to you." So that's a kind of a practice too in this world, is to keeping your equilibrium, is to forbear things. You think that maybe these negative things are happening to you and it's your fault, but it's the fault of many other things besides you. The gunas are there cycling all the time, and those are natural cycles. That's nature, that's the mind of ancestors and the humans together, that's the mind of the great mind, and the Mahat, they call it. All of these things are going through cycles, so you have to have a foreview, or a preview, if you will, of that's going to be happening to me my whole life, until I can get my mind in such a place that it goes beyond sattva, balance. Because balance is what people are striving for, but they're only attaining it for a certain time. Then they're falling out of it and getting back into it, falling out of it. Those are the three gunas, triguna, it's called in Sanskrit. In India, it's a teaching that's particular to India and classic in yoga and in Vedanta and in Buddhism too. So sattva, rajas, and tamas are three words you should memorize and just put in your vocabulary. Call them equilibrium, dynamism, and stasis if you want. But however you would look at them or title them, you should know that they're always going in cycles, and that you cannot, it's shifting sand that Christ talked about. You cannot depend on shifting sand for very long. You'll fall through a sinkhole, or earthquake will come, see. So you need the bedrock, as Christ said, of spirit. So gunas are one thing that are constantly not your fault. The only fault you would have there is coming into a world that is based in the three gunas in the first place. And that gets into some higher teachings about non-embodiment or transcendental awareness. That's not where we configure from where we are right now. We are in the body, and Brahman is our objective. So all this talk about I am one with reality is a little bit far-fetched for most people. We have to go again at the practice, keep at the practice that gets us back into the equilibrium, that will show us that we are the non-dual spirit. And then hopefully next time we see that, it won't just be a glimpse and forgetfulness, but it will be something we can grab onto. And I will be single, and we shall know the truth finally and for all times. That's samadhi. Ekagra, it's also called, one-pointed state or single-eyed state. So Shankara says if you brood on sense objects, thirst for enjoyment will come. And then desire to possess them will follow. I'm going to run through this quickly now. Appearance of a delusion is quickly on the onset then. Then you've reached the cold ground floor of neglect of Brahman. Whereas before you still had a chance to get into balance. People are now neglecting their true nature. They've, as the Song of India say, they've bartered the pure gold at the center of their being for a world of mere glass objects and tinsel. So they've given away everything that's important for these sense objects, for desire and for possessions. It's classic, and there are people who do this and suffer, and there are people who do this and enjoy. That's the Mayic thing, that's the confusing thing, is the people who are suffering, seeing people attaining things and enjoying them, think, oh, that's the path, and so they go and try and do that. But their cycle of their mind right now in this lifetime is not where they can necessarily achieve that kind of apparent satisfaction of objects. And Mother's actually throwing her grace upon them by making them suffer. So we had that recently at our retreat. Just Holy Mother's saying that we took upon us that suffering is a sign of God's grace. So if you're enjoying things and everything is going on fine in your life, that's suspect. and just have to watch and see how long that lasts. If it lasts throughout your whole life, then you probably attained sattva. And there's a downside to that too. It's called going to heaven and coming back as a moral person. But the ecstasy, the outright bliss of transcendental reality, of Brahman, of oneness with reality, will never be known in that condition of sattva. So, in all these levels of consciousness that the seers of India talk about in these different systems, there's a lot to take account of, and many things to attain in spiritual life. Fruits, higher fruits. Fruits that you get by turning the key in the lock in the opposite direction, and that you never would have figured. It's not like getting fruits here on earth. The eternal money-making, as Vivekananda called it. So we stop there at the appearance of delusion. At that point, you're headed for the freezing basement of forgetfulness of your true nature, and that goes like this. Down the next step, the ball of the mind bounces to the ego, gets a hold of the whole thing. Of course, it was present at the beginning, but maybe you had some intelligence that was presiding over it that kept you from brooding on the sense objects. Can you remember a time when you didn't think about sense objects and you were perfectly happy? Is the question. Or can you now take your mind off of sense objects and be perfectly happy and not think about them and just take them as they come and go, like a meal? The food comes, the food goes, and so forth, and you keep your mind on divine reality nonetheless, despite the enticements of the tongue, the palate, the nose, the sight of food, hearing about food. Otherwise, food can become your life. And that can also be a good and a bad thing. And when it's a good thing, it's also a bad thing. It's not the best thing, let's say, to become attached to food. So, thirst for enjoyment quite often has to do, of course, with these five senses. And the five senses are attached to the five elements. And that's why we teach you in yoga, you're taught to connect taste to water and smell to earth and sight to fire and touch to that's right, and ether to hearing, right. So all of those five have to go in contact with the other five, and you have to make these connections consciously, because then you have some grounds for knowing what the senses like. And then there's subtle senses in dream tonight, and you also have to find out what they like in the realm of subtle form, where they attach to, because if you can find out what your subtle senses are attaching to in dream, you can work on it in the waking state and remove a lot of blockages that are keeping you from going into deep sleep with full consciousness. Everyone goes into deep sleep, but they're not in full consciousness when they do. Only a few go into deep sleep in full consciousness and see the seeds there. If you can see the seeds in your consciousness, then you'll know that by watering them with your mind's attention and your senses, you'll see this whole process can happen as you take embodiment. Or you can take embodiment and keep all of this from happening and just live a life of service to the divine in the Dharma, and don't become attached to anything and give up your body easily. So that would be best attained by seeing the seeds in deep sleep that are there. I just said Asampragata Samadhi was the name of his samadhi that he talks about. It means seedless, Asampragata. There's a samadhi that's also with seeds, Sampragata. So you're actually having samadhi of all these external things on the gross and subtle level. And that's a very high samadhi too, like wisdom samadhi, knowledge samadhi, where things come from. Not just from outside, but from inside your mind, how they come from seeds, would be Sampragata Samadhi. But Asampragata Samadhi would be seedless. A person could only attain that by keeping their eye open in deep sleep state and seeing all these seeds, that all the worlds come out of these seeds. And I have a new chart to show you, not a new chart, but a chart that's been colorized, freshly. And I can show you that later today, maybe, about the 4 stages of the word and how things trickle down from seeds into manifestation, and how when they so-called die or get destroyed or disappear, that they just return to their seed form again. So that's how you get to these teachings, that everything exists at all times. If it's not in form, then it's in its formless state, and it never gets destroyed completely. It just moves back and forth from manifest to unmanifest, and from unmanifest back into manifest. If you know that, then you can have some pragyata samadhi, and you can escape fear, and you can escape brooding, and you can escape attachment to sense objects, and because there's as many of those sense objects available to you as you could ever want. They're in your own mind. All you need to do is water their seeds. Some sort of the same thing happens out here. If I want something, I think about it and I go get it. So you bring it into manifestation, don't you? You could even create it out of nothing, out of the 5 elements. Think I'll make a house. See, it wasn't there before. A couple months later, oh, there it is, now I can move in, you see. Try not to bring a lot of belongings with you when you move. So, yes, everything comes into manifestation from an unmanifested state, and it's true on all levels of your being. So, all of that is work. All of that should be work as worship, but it can turn into a lot of suffering. And if the bouncing ball of the mind goes the wrong direction and finally settles after the supremacy of the ego, unripe ego takes over, into bondage, outright bondage. You could call that samsara. Samsari, I'm sorry. You become very sorry about falling into such a deep state of unconsciousness. So that's a quick review of the 7 descending steps of negligence of Brahman. Starting with this brooding on the sense objects, thirst for enjoyment, desire to possess those things, the mind gets deluded, then the supremacy of the ego, and finally the advent of outright bondage. Shankara's teachings, again, if you want to look them up, slokas 321 through 329 of the Vivekachudamani, which I just culled out of that great scripture and put into a visual here, if you will, and also put a nice cold Alaskan scene of a frozen river behind it with its different levels, even a frozen waterfall of all things. So that's how the mind freezes and loses its vitality and falls into abject bondage. Now, if we just keep that in mind as one of the themes of these 5 series class, and then shift over to Shankara's Doorways to Yoga, you can see here, starting from the bottom, that he wants to take you out of this by giving you the practice of yoga. So practice of yoga for him would start with mauna, that is control of speech. He says, be quiet, destroy darkness by seeing oneness everywhere. So he has a sort of a high criterion even at the lowest step. You see, the lowest doorway asks you to be very lofty-minded already, because you have to confirm for yourself or affirm overall that oneness is. Sarvosmi, everything is one of the great one-word mantras, 3 matra mantras. So he says Sarvosmi means everything is. And Sarva means everything. Sarvam kalvidam Brahman, all this is Brahman. But that's a long step away first to see all this is Brahman, because of course you're not going to want to make the mistake of calling an object Brahman. An object has its seed in the mind, it's a projection, and so it can't be Brahman. But Brahman is behind it as its objectness. See, Swami Vivekananda used to say that. I don't have any money to give you or any wealth. I'm just an itinerant monk. But I can give you the secret of the goldness of gold, the secret of the silverness of silver, the secret of the manliness of man, and the secret of the womanliness of women. That I can give you. So he's talking about the essence of each thing, not the thing itself. The thing itself is an add-on, is a projection. If you want a false superimposition, if you care to say so, an outright illusion, an appearance in time that disappears just as readily. So it's the essence behind the thing, the swarupa, in which you would say all this is Brahman. You could only say that and have it be philosophically correct if you knew that and had seen that underlying substratum in everything. So that's how, again, a part of a practice at a higher level, isn't it? Is that at first you're just keeping the mind in cognizance of Brahman so you don't neglect it. But later on, you're practicing seeing Brahman in everything. In means behind, not as the thing itself. Because you could then transgress the Advaitic axioms that are so precious to Vedanta and to non-dual reality in every religion. So he asks you to be very high-minded right away. See oneness everywhere. Be quiet and see oneness everywhere. I think I mentioned even 2 weeks ago that beautiful saying of Holy Mother, Shisharda Devi, when she said, be quiet, notice everything that goes on around you, but never talk about it. It's a great practice. What to speak of, maybe even a principle, is that a person would become that observant of everything, mindful and conscious in thought, word, and deed, but would never speak about it. Because there it is. Control of speech would be the very first thing. The minute you let words out of your mouth, if those words are directed towards a person of equally high-mindedness of yourself, it will be understood, you see. That's called having holy company and talking spiritual. And there's no danger in that. But those same words spoken in another atmosphere or to any other level of consciousness can cause all sorts of problem. Misunderstandings, criticisms, fault-finding, disagreements, violence. So words are very powerful, and again, later today or next somebody will get to that, some talk about how words are important, because he wants you to join the word to the mind eventually. So we went up this 2 weeks ago. I'm taking you up quickly this time. Be quiet, destroy darkness by seeing oneness in everything. That's control of speech, first doorway to yoga. Second, remain alone and practice yoga. Okay, so most of us aren't monks, most of us aren't cave dwellers, most of us aren't wandering ascetics in this day and age. Most of us have families around us, some of us have companions. So he means in those cases that you should go into solitude every once in a while, to the forest or to the beach, the ocean side, or to the mountaintop, as the great ones did, and practice yoga alone. And then come back into, like you would go on retreat nowadays, then come back to family and go into retreat, so that you get reminded at first that there are other times and climes that are available to you, rather than just conventional family life where mundane things are happening every day. Mundane things that could maybe risk this kind of a fall. Probably even people who are very good people have experienced this, maybe, and pulled themselves out of it when they did. Other people don't have that much strength, and they would experience it and fall into bondage for lifetimes. But it's in our memory that brooding on sense objects, and of course it's a good teaching in Western materialistic culture nowadays, is a very potent danger for most people, until some of them being very happy with the problem, some of them suffering it. But for those who want to witness it from a distance, then this is the way to go, not this. This is the bouncing ball of the mind downward, and this is the buoyant hot air balloon of the mind going upwards. See? So keep that in mind as you contrast the two, which is why I put them together in this series of classes. He says, if you remain alone and practice yoga, then give up expectation, desires, and practice non-receiving. Of course, I went into that in depth last weekend before last, how non-receiving for Patanjali is not giving and taking goods, not engaging in commerce. If you do so, doing it very carefully and very sparingly, so that your daily activities won't take over your whole mind and make you forget your past lifetimes. It's interesting that people might, and I didn't say this 2 weeks ago in class, but people might think of their past lifetimes as a memory all of a sudden that they'll see everything. But actually, when you're in a high state of mind, you are living in your past lifetimes. You're already aware of them. Everything is paid forward, and it's not like your memories are going to take you very far. In fact, people's memories quite often are weights on them that keep them in a sentimental atmosphere or brooding, thinking back on things that they wish they could have again, and so forth. So when you're living in a high state of consciousness, that is, your past lifetimes are there with you. Everything is paid forward, and you're yourself in full. Everything you've ever experienced is available to you right then. And that's the beauty of that moment, the eternal moment they call it. It's neither the past, nor is it the present, nor is it the future. Those are called trikala, the three phases of time. And living in the present, as I've often said before, is not the solution. Living in the eternal moment is beyond all three of those phases of time. And when you do it, you are yourself. And everything is in full within you. Again, teaching the four phases of the word will make that clearer later in this series. So again, I stop on this great teaching of non-receiving, only in a little bit different mode this week. Let's go on though. Control of senses and mind. Join the word with the mind. So that is something we'll look at deeper when I bring up that teaching of the four phases of the word. But for now, let's finish this doorways to yoga all the way to the end so we can look back on specific salient teachings. After that, you control the senses and the mind by joining the word with the mind. You would control thought. Finally, I can control my own thoughts. What a novel idea. He says, join the mind with the intellect, and then join the intellect with the ego. So Shankara, this is Shankara's teaching on the eight-limbed system of Patanjali in many respects. Oftentimes in his scriptures he would say, Mano, Buddhi, Sharira, Tanmatram, Indriyam, Bhutani, na Bhuta Panchakam. Aham Kritas Chapi Vyat Swarupakam. Tam Ishvam Atmanam Upuiti Shashvatam is out of the scriptures of Shankara. So he means that person who can dissolve the mind, the intellect, the senses, the subtle senses, the elements and the subtle elements, tanmatras, along with the ego, aham kritas chapi, aham kara means into Brahman, that person is a realizer of Brahman. And that's the way it's always been, he says. And so it is. So those are sets of fives that we've talked about. It's one of the reasons why we look into the sets of fives, is so that we can have those in our mind and know what we've accomplished once we've accomplished it. It's good not to be taken by surprise all the time, you know. Sometimes spiritual life will surprise you. Other times it's good just to do a practice and expect a result and have it be that way, and not be surprised by the outcome. And that's what studying the 24 cosmic principles of Samkhya, or the eightfold path of the Lord Buddha, and systems like that really prepare you for, so that you're not caught by surprise. You can take advantage of spiritual fruits when they dawn on you. Be aware of realization when it happens to you. There's such a thing called stunned awareness. They call it stunned awareness, where mind gets stunned by what it sees and then it can't remember it later. So some of these things are too powerful for the human brain, you see. So that's why it's good to have some preparation. So control of thought, that's a very important juncture. You can see right there at that curve that you're joining the mind with the intellect and the intellect with the ego. Remember, yoga is all about union, isn't it? So if you've become fallen out of balance, then you have to make connections. This is nothing new. It's something ancient and eternal that you've fallen out of, and you're trying to make the reconnections to. It's like I've said, cutting a trail through a forest and going away and not coming back for a couple of years, and coming back and it's all overgrown again. So you go away a couple lifetimes after you had this lifetime of intense practice. The next time you come back, hopefully you can see where you cut that trail, because the undergrowth hasn't grown so far yet, you see, to cover up that trail that you made earlier. So to keep it open all the time, of course, is what Shankara talks about. He says, they said, well, you're a realized soul, why do you keep doing sadhana, spiritual practices? And he said, because I want to keep my mind wiped clean like a mirror every day, so that I can always see Brahman as clearly as possible while I'm in the body, mind mechanism, you see, psychophysical being. So you can be realized and go away from the body, come back to the body again, and have to re-realize in a sense. But if you keep that trail cut down and that mirror of the mind wiped clean all the time, then that's going to be the best form of yoga that can be attained. Whether you're beyond form or in form, whether you're in waking or in dream, to always have that kind of clarity. Khyati, it's called. Khyati was an important word to Shankara, important word to Patanjali, and it's an important word in Buddhism. So those three things you see are common. The path to Kaivalya in Patanjali's yoga is accompanied by Khyati, clarity of mind. And it can't be attained without it. The rain cloud of virtues, Dharma Mega Samadhi, all these beautiful things that come raining down upon your mind after you've had a beatific vision, would not be possible without clarity of mind. And if it were, clarity of mind would put them in their place, because you could get stunned, you see, overwhelmed, and not come back from that experience taking very much away. So if Khyati is always there, then you know where to place it. So all of these things interconnected. SRV and its teachers, Lex6 and myself, we've always taught by way of connections, reconnecting or making connections. It's not like something new, nothing new under the sun, Ecclesiastes said. And he was very, very correct when he said that. It's all been done before, it's all been here before. In fact, it's always here at all times. It's just whether it's manifested or it's not. And when it's unmanifested and you don't need to see the seeds to it, and then you come into the manifested, which is the manifestation of the seeds, then you get confused. And so you can't live a conscious lifetime, and you die an unconscious death. And part of that would be by engaging in receiving of too many gifts, you see, like we said. Non-receiving. It's called parigraha. So if you're just lifetimes of commerce, business, you see, merchants, that kind of thing, that merchant class runs that risk of having some scars of selling and buying all the time. And that's why there's so many of them in the world all the time, in every culture. So there's a way of doing everything dharmically. You could be a street sweeper. It's a nice word for it. Maintaining the gutters and sewers and all that, and do it dharmically, and you'd just be as high as a king in his palace. You might even be better off than a king in his palace. So the way to do things in the Dharma is really the key to everything, and that has to do with yoga, and yoga has to do with practice, as long as you're in the body. So you keep that mirror of the mind wiped clean, and that's what he's talking about at this juncture here. Now, further on is the attainment of peace. Let's just say that before this brooding, this ball of the mind fell into the risk of brooding on sense objects, that it was here. You see. It had peace, it had harmony, and all of a sudden it begins to fall, and it wonders, how did I ever fall from my earlier station of peace and equanimity, and how do I get back? Not a good scenario. It's especially in a culture and a time where everyone is running towards money, everyone's running towards objects, everyone's running towards this thirst for enjoyment, everyone's running to possess. You see, it's the norm today. Maya is the norm. More so now than ever, and Sri Ramakrishna warned us about that in the 1800s. He says, worldliness now has become a chronic disease. And I think that's an outdated statement already. That's what it was back in India at the time. What it is now in America is much exacerbated from that. And you have to stand back and look at it in amazement sometimes, just to try and even comprehend that people have bartered away the gold at the center of their being for this world of colored glass and marbles that they want to possess and enjoy. Like I always thought it was like eating cotton candy for dinner, that kind of life. You're thinking you're getting nourished, tastes good for a second, and turns acidic and disease follows. But that kind of tract then is not a healthy one to follow along, and this is the way up and out of it. So I think these two make a very good combination together. So peace of mind is there, right at her left hand. You see, she's there. She's right here, almost in this mudra. She's got her hand on the world. May peace come to you, my child. At that point, you want to join that ego that you were working on with the witness. You're not joining it with the intellect anymore. The intellect knows that there's a higher teacher, a higher knower inside of itself. So it's going to want to hook that up to the witness, sakshi bhutam, they call that in Sanskrit. It's the witness of all phenomena, and everything that they were enjoying here that risked falling into this cold basement of forgetfulness had to do with phenomena. The march of objects, the march of events, times, races, cultures, lifetimes, births, lives, deaths, all of it had to do with phenomena. It was always accompanied by phenomena. So there's this beautiful saying that Vedantas came up with earlier, the dance of the Naumanan. If you see Mother Kali or Mother Shiva dance, then they've danced away all phenomena. There's no more manifestation anymore. They've in Shiva's case, he's reduced it all to ashes. In Kali's case, he's reduced it all to the space of awareness, blackness. So the dance of the Naumanan. But everyone else is doing the dance of the phenomenon. You see, they're dancing in activities, and they're dancing in rounds of birth and death. They're dancing in daily mundane activities, rounds in cycles like that. And they're in the river going around all the time. They never get on the banks, as Lord Buddha said, to watch what was happening and to see what happened to them once they got out of that river, to feel higher inspiration that they once felt, which posited them right there. And they thought they would never fall out of that. See? So peace, very, very high level, like we say shanti, shanti, shanti after every sloka, after every saying. In Muslimism, may peace be upon them. Muhammad, may peace be upon him. The word peace in the East and in the Middle East is a very powerful word. And it's not a peace that's the opposite of war. That's a sort of peace that's masquerading as itself. But it's an inner peace. It's an eternal peace too. So it has degrees of intensity and realization. Beyond that, the ego vanishes. So you can see how beautiful Shankara looks at Father of Yoga's system and begins to actually describe the dynamics of what happens when you follow 8 limbs, in this case 7 doors. And you can see that basically back here where the mind and the intellect got joined after understanding the word, after the mind understands the word, then the mind and intellect got joined, and then the ego came into the picture. And you've got the antakarna there, the fourfold mind, as one unit now, whereas before it was separate, like 4 horses, each one to take their own route. And the mind was going with the senses. The bouncing ball of the mind, The intellect wasn't that much involved in it, or it was seeking only after secular things, secular attainments, you see. And the ego was trying to own those things, and the word wasn't understood yet. Or the word was understood only on the outer level, the level of sound, external sound, ears to tongue, to alphabets. But the meaning of all those words, the deeper meaning, was never known. So he's beginning to unite each one of these things with each other, join them to the witness, and then finally the ego vanishes altogether. And here's where samadhi starts to take place. The higher limbs of yoga are explained by Shankara in this way. And before the break, I want to show you side by side how this works with Patanjali and Shankara's system. I'll show you that in a second, if I brought it. Yes, I did. All right, so to finish this trajectory, though, join the witness with Brahman would, of course, be coming from, you might say, Sampragyata Samadhi, or Savitarka Samadhi in Vedanta, to Nirvikalpa. Savikalpa Vedanta to Nirvikalpa Vedanta, or Sampragyata Samadhi to Asampragyata Samadhi in yoga. Very much the same thing, and again, only 500 or 600 years apart in their history. So if you can vanish, the ego can diminish to such an extent, then that's where the witness can join with Brahman, and you get the bliss of Brahman, unalloyed, uninterrupted, whereas peace could have been interrupted. Happiness, just definitely back and forth with sorrow, and joy back and forth also with misery. So basically you get to the bliss of Brahman, and you have an unalloyed, uninterrupted state of bliss. It could even be the bliss of equanimity. That's a kind of samadhi called sthiti samadhi, where a person, being a soul, reaches this high level of mind and just prefers to stay there. Doesn't want to have ecstatic bliss, and doesn't want to have any interruption to that equanimity. And that's the level the seers prefer to stay at. See, the realm of the seers, the rishis. They know if they just attain that and stay there, everything's fine. They can go to a higher samadhi from there. It's like a springboard. So what does that springboard lead to? Attachment to and detachment from objects at will. Objects, let's go back, you see, to where we started to brood on them. So no matter what you have to say about objects, they're very important. So I used to say, I object to objects, because they're always in the way, you're always hurting yourself on them, you always run the risk of getting attached to them, and the whole world is, you base your whole mind in objectivity. But the eternal subject is never known. There's the infernal objects, and then there's the eternal subject, is how I like to put that. And up here is all about the eternal subject. It knows it's mastered. So the seer is not attached to the scene up there. The seer knows that the scene comes out of it, so it can detach from them at any time. See? And it can also attach to them at any time and give them up at any time it wants. That's total yogic mastery. So only by that meditation that is free from doubts does one realize the self in nirvikalpa. That is, beyond sets of time, kalpas. And kalpa also means mental imaginings in time. Kalpanika means mental imaginings in time, so that's what the mind's engaging in. All of this is mental imaginings in time, using objects fashioned by the mind out of seeds that are in the mind. It's the way all of India looks at it, and it's looked at it for time out of mind. It's a nice expression. Otherwise, thoughts will enter in the unstable mind, which will then get mixed up with them. Well, that's about here. You see, thoughts enter into the unstable mind, and noise and vibration begins, and then just connect this doorway backwards into brooding on sense objects, and you just fall right on down. The other trajectory to go, outward only, as compared to inward, as compared to being master of both the outer and the inner. So there's really three things being suggested here. You could call one of them negligence of Brahman, the other one, practice of yoga, and the third, attainment of your true state, your true nature. Okay? Clear? Now let's go on. So before the break, let's look at this historical event that happened that was one of the unique things in time. I mean, you can look into Tibetan Buddhism and you can look into certain stories in the New and Old Testaments and avail yourself of what we call in India the itihasa. Itihasa is a kind of scripture that includes stories of relationships between beings. It always includes the sages and the seers in it. That's the beautiful thing about India, is that you don't just have like fairy tales or some sort of fables that are going on without any real spiritual moral. There might be some moral to them, ethical, but the spiritual morality is missing from most of those in other countries. In India, this itihasa is replete with stories about how street sweepers and kings and queens and royalty and military and everything came across seers and saints in the world, and wandering ascetics and cave yogis and so forth, enlightened souls, and had their conversations and their experiences with them, got saved by them quite often, and got their mind awakened in other cases. That's what's replete in the itihasa of India. So in that way, the itihasa, in a more modern way, you could say this is like 600, 700 AD. For India, that's very contemporary. That's very modern. We know the more modern beings from Shankara on, like Chaitanya and all the way up to Vivekananda and Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi and other great, authentic, noble contemporary rishis of India. But if we look at this period here, we find out that those three great beings that were there were Shankara, Govindapada, and Gaudapada. Now, Gaudapada was the earliest of them. He was the great non-dual teacher with the Karaka on the Mandukya Upanishad that we've studied. Famous Karaka and non-duality. His student was then Govindapada, and then Govindapada's student was Shankara. Here's Shankara finding his teacher, this image. This is Govindapada had gone into a cave, and the cave had fallen down around him, and so he just sat there meditating. He was going to give up his body. It was fine with him. But Shankara left his family when he was 12 and went wandering at the permission, finally, of his mother. And of course, he was a soul that had been totally aware of all the Indian scriptures at 8 years of age. Amazing phenomena of a very high kind. Speak about phenomena. But this great young man then at 12 went looking for his guru, already in full possession of everything he needed to know. He was a realized soul in a body. It was sort of like Christ at 14 saying, I must be about my Father's business now. He told his father and mother, I'm leaving now. Must be about my Father's business. Well, that's what happened, and it's happened in India from time out of mind. Shankara left at 12. He came upon this village. I'm cutting this story down to a very short version, of course. And the villagers said that there was a mountain yogi up in the cave, and the cave, mouthway of the cave had fallen in, and he was in there, and they didn't see him anymore much. So Shankara got some of the men of the village, went up to the mouth of the cave, had them clear away the stones, and walked in, and here's the scene of him walking into the cave and seeing Govindapada, his guru, sitting there. And Govindapada said, I've been waiting for you to come. There's some things I need to teach you before I leave the body. And so Shankara sat down, and they, for the next weeks or months that Govindapada kept the body, transmitted him some important teachings that Gaudapada, that Shankara needed to know. So Gaudapada was his teacher, Govindapada was Shankara's teacher, but you know that Govindapada was also the father of yoga back in 140 BC. So this is his next incarnation after he put together the 8 limbs of yoga. as Patanjali. So 140 BC, then another 500 years has passed, which is about the distance between these great souls, like avatars, every 500 years or so. And so add 500 years onto that, that's about 640, that's about the time of Gaudapada and Govindapada. So this is historical fact behind this, that Shankara's teacher was not only Govindapada, who was Gaudapada's teacher, was also the father of yoga reincarnated 500 years later. So that's why it needs not only interesting in the telling, but that's also why that Shankara was such a good commentator on the yogic system. See, so Negligence of Brahman and Shankara's doorways to yoga. There they are. This young man put them in the Vivekachudamani. This young man wrote scriptures. They came out of him. You can't say that about other enlightened saints and seers. Even his teacher's teacher only commented on scriptures. Well, he wrote one or two. But Shankara came out of him, by the dozens. And he's called an Amsa avatar, avatar of Shiva. So he had all of these great teachings. One of them we're drawing from here, when Vivekachudamani, slokas 367 to 371. And here, these slokas from 321 to 329 are all from the Vivekachudamani. So good to know historically as well, so you can put together the connections in the teachings between Vedanta and yoga. Because these two darshanas of India are two of the orthodox darshanas. They're the Astika darshanas. And Samkhya is another one, of course. So here we have Shankara's ability then to comment on the eight-limbed system. Now here's what he did after talking with Govindapada, of course. It's very likely Govindapada could have said, well, in my last lifetime I put together the eight-limb yoga, ho-hum. Oh. And now it's, many centuries have passed, really we need a little bit of a facelift to yoga again. Why don't you do it? That's what I'm thinking. See, so told Shankara, put together some of those important steps that in the Kali Yoga people are beginning to forget, even when they study my eight-limbed system, which is now 500 or 600 years old. Why don't you add some things to it? And here's what Shankara did. Of course, this is my speculation, but it seems pretty obvious that he took this eight-limbed system, which you see listed here, and turned it into some 14 or so other system. He added some 8 or 9 limbs to it. And here's what they are. Let's look at them before the break. So based on that backdrop then, you can see yamas and niyamas, and I'll just put this up for viewing until we get to it after the break. But there's the yamas and niyamas that we'll look at real briefly. So those are 5 of those and 5 of these. So many good things come in 5s. We call it quintuplication or pancha in Sanskrit. Pancha yamas, pancha niyamas. There's 5 of each. I won't go into it at length right now, but there's such things as non-violence, non-receiving, have been mentioned earlier in this class already. Then here's some quotes in which we can say about that from Shankara. External renunciation is achieved by giving up gross things. Internal by giving up the ego. So he gives you one of the dynamics of practice of yamas, niyamas. Give up gross things and you get external renunciation. But that's not enough, because we see people, even monks and so forth, externally renouncing the world but not yet gaining enlightenment, so they come back as monks again, just like a businessman or a merchant would come back as a merchant again. So there must be some other dynamics here. So the internal renunciation, like the mastery of a Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, is very important if we study him. And you get this, and Swami Vivekananda, this internal renunciation that has to do with giving up the ego. Now, this is easy to say, but it's very difficult to do, and it's probably the greatest secret of all. is to be able to renounce the ego. And that's why we had it as one of the important steps here, see, is to join the ego with the intellect, and join the mind with the intellect, and join them to the ego, so that the ego then vanishes, as it says here. It just vanishes. And when the ego gets out of the way, then you'll have a great seer. Probably you could summate that by saying, I know nothing. And all these two great beings I just mentioned, Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna, were often heard to be saying that. Mother knows everything, I know nothing. So there must be a great secret then in the ego letting go of its possession, not only of objects, external renunciation, because there's a great risk in that, but also of its knowledge. And not only of its secular knowledge, but of its spiritual knowledge too. As then it reaches a state of giving up ownership of its spiritual knowledge, then it becomes this wide open channel, which the ego is not in the way of the flow of, and then you have this great transmitter, this transmission of teachings going on unstintingly and throughout their lives, even up to 32 years that Shankara did it. That's all he lived. And Vivekananda lived only 39 years. Wide open channel at an early age for these teachings. So, again, that's why I'm saying it's easy to say this, but it's a great secret that needs to be contemplated and meditated upon, is how facile and how wonderful is that soul who can give up attachment of the ego to possession of knowledge and possession of spiritual knowledge, possession of Dharma. Should know all the Dharma, but should not attach to it. Sort of like Holy Mother saying, again, know everything that happens around you, but don't talk about it. So you're not attached to it. If you were really attached to it, you'd be gibbling and gabbling about it all the time, you see. They couldn't stop talking about it, and that's what people do. They gossip, they fault find, they criticize. And that was one of Holy Mother's teachings. Don't find fault with others. You'll never have peace of mind if you find fault. So to be quiet on the verbal level, externally, is very much connected to this kind of quietude of the ego around spiritual knowledge. It just gives up about it. Oh yeah, it'll talk about it, like I'm doing. It'll get fascinated with it, it'll get obsessed with it even, but it won't attach to it, and it won't possess it as its own. It'll just let it be, and then speak about higher things, and open up channels to yoga, doorways to yoga with it, like Shankar did. So that's what basically he's saying in this very pregnant statement. I'll say it again. External renunciation is achieved by giving up gross things, internal by giving up the ego. Those are a very pregnant statement that needs to be contemplated in your spare time. Next quote there, under the yamas and niyamas, is control of the speech is the first door to yoga. Well, we know that because we put that back here. Next quote, think of soul in the soul, not in the body or mind. Shankar had a very direct way of clarifying things, and sort of deceivingly direct. If you were sitting with him and he said something like that to you, it might go right over your head, because it's so simple, it sounds so simple. But later on you'd be thinking about it in some nearby tree while he was resting, and you think, oh, what is that he said? Think about the soul, not in the body and the mind. And you'd be all of a sudden realizing that you've been thinking about the soul lodged in the body all this time, or your mind being the soul, or your ego being the soul. But his whole teaching is totally against that and away from that. That the soul must be thought of as being in the soul, and nowhere else. And that the ego, mind, and body are just offshoots of that. They're the antakarana, and the antakarana, according to everyone, all the way back to Kapila, is part of Prakriti. Nature, not part of Purusha. So again, making connections based upon the realizations of the past seers. You have to take their word for it. You have to give away your doubt, see, about that, and finally the ego will die when the doubt dies. Until then, you're your own worst enemy, and you're not making any headway lifetime to lifetime. So I hand-selected each one of these for that kind of intense meditation that you need to do. Manana, here's your manana about this. See. The fourth one is, there is one who is the witness of all states. We mentioned that earlier, Sakshibhutam, the witness of all phenomena, but also the witness of all states. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep would probably be one way of saying it, because his teacher's teacher was Gaudapada, who brought back that teaching about A-U-M, the word, meaning waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, and Turiya being beyond all three of those states. So, witness of all those states. And as far back as Pipalada, one of the most ancient of all Indian rishis on record, he was talking about connecting A to U to M. Connect your waking to your dreaming, to your deep sleep, and see them. So what was Shankara's way of saying that in modern times? Om drishyam pratitam pravilapayan san tan matram anandaganam san matram anandaganam vibhavayam. Samahita san bahir antaram va. Bahir antaram. Connect the external bahir with the antaram, inner, and render them into one indivisible state. Then pass your time contentedly. Meditate upon that state and be free. So, witness of all states of consciousness, you see, would happen somewhere in that process. Best if it happened early on, and it grew and matured into being able to render your waking, dreaming, and deep sleep state into one state, and not think about it as in three anymore. Just like you're not thinking about the body as being in three, right? I'm sorry, the soul as being in three. You're not thinking about the soul as being in your body, and you're not thinking about it as being in your mind, and you're not thinking about it as being in your ego. You're thinking about it as being in the soul. So in the very same way, you're doing the same with the three states of consciousness. Three, it's three, what I'm talking about. And that brings us to asana, which is a good place to stop. Begin something higher. We'll get to this after the break. We'll look at what he says about the third limb. And remember, the good part of it is that we're going to afterwards take a look at what Shankara did with his teacher's eight-limbed yoga and turned it into, added at least 8 or 9 different features to it. So you'll know the current yoga, you might want to say, that Shankara was so qualified to comment on, his teacher being the incarnation of the father of yoga. So here we will take a several-minute break. Thank you. And here we are sitting in asana. That is ekasana, in this condition, trying to maintain one posture, which becomes effortless, Shankara says, after a time. The mind gets used to taking its attention off the body and off the senses. And it usually does that, according to the Upanishads, by mastering the prana. That's the second best way. First best way is by having the mind mastered and pure when you enter the body, as before you enter the body. And there has to be admitted that might not only as a proof that the rebirth theory, as they say, is true, at least relatively speaking, but it also shows the fact that there are many, many beings that come into the body without ever having to master the body and senses. Their senses are always under their control. They never practice hatha yoga or asana, and like Shankara and Gaudapada and so forth. And could, like Jesus or Buddha, go out into the wilderness without even knowing a thing about asana, sit down like this and just fall into meditation under a tree, well, say for 49 days. Or for 30 days in the wilderness or something. So, that being the case then, Shankara says asana should be natural, and we'll get to his way of looking about that, but let's see how the father of yoga talks about asana, which is where we ended out in the first half of the class, right here. So we're looking at the eight-limbed yoga. We've studied Patanjali's yoga in many retreats in SRV over these 20 or more years that we've been together studying the Dharma, and we've looked at it from all sides. Here's yet another side of looking at it, going through it in this way in terms of Shankara's non-dual Advaita next door to it, looking at yoga as a practice. So about this third limb of asana that Patanjali talked about, he says, give up the idea of the self in the sheaths and recognize yourself as Brahman. That's how he would put Advaita Vedanta together with the onerous presence of these five sheaths: body, energy, called prana, mind, intellect, and ego, which we saw in the doorways to yoga were things he was joining along the way, sort of like coming along and conquering each and then owning it, you see, and rather than letting it be its own independent entity, always giving you a problem from some distant province or something. Oh, my body's bothering me, or oh, my senses aren't under my control. But notice you said my in each case. It was my body and it was my senses. So that's where possessing something is good, when you can possess it after mastering it. You try and possess it before mastering it, well, shall we go through the negligence of Brahman chart again and show how that can get out of control. So recognize the self in the self, and not in the sheaths. As you could say, there are traces of the self's qualities in the sheaths. Like in the ego, is the self itself is in there. The higher self is potential there. And in the intellect, knowledge is there. And in the mind, thoughts are there. And in prana, the energy is there in its five forms. So in all of these things you can see the warmth of fire in all of them. That's Brahman's the fire, and its warmth happens as intellect, as thought in the intellect, or intelligence in the intellect, and thought in the mind, and energy in the prana, and so forth. Those things are there, but again, if they're not mastered, then they can cause problems. So the best way of mastering them, as I started off saying in the second half of this class, is to have the mind under control all the time. At the time of your death and before you enter into the next body, should you decide to take a body, which should only be in full consciousness, as Vivekananda said. Another quote here under asana: that one who is free in the body is free in the body, is free without a body also. So Vivekananda also said much the same. He said, it'll be very good to get out of this body. I'll feel myself to be even more free than I feel here in the body. So he felt free in the body, also felt the limitations of the body, of course, but in a non-attached sense, he often mentioned that could be that I'll be feel very free to get up and out of this body, he said. And we can't help but notice the correlations between Shankara and Swami Vivekananda. Not only in their short lifespan, they each lived 32 and 39 years respectively, but they also were full of wisdom and enlightened at an early age, and so many correlations are there. Last quote in Dharasana: "Subtle knowledge, understanding the difference between the seer and the seen, is perfect seeing." Samyak darshana, perfect seeing, is one of the eightfold paths too. It's in Buddhism, it's in Shankara, and it's in yoga. These are all Indian systems, and I never tire of showing how these Indian systems, even though as religions they might have become a bit far-flung from each other and disassociated with each other in some ways, or even at competition with one another, or seen as different from one another, not ever the case. For the seer, all of these systems are Indian systems, and they're part of Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma. And seeing in that way is the way that the higher beings like Krishna, Shiva, and others would see them, as concomitants of the same singular eternal Dharma of India. All right, so let's go to the fourth limb, pranayama. We know pranayama is not just breathing exercise, but getting a hold of the prana and knowing how it empowers everything from body to senses, that there's a prana working at different levels, and there's a prana working in the body to digest foods, for instance, and so forth, and to excrete waste, and a prana working in the senses to give the power of the eye to see and the power of the ear to hear. It's a great thing just to sit and think to yourself, how do my eyes see, and how do my ears hear? Because that's often taken for granted. It's a good meditation just on itself to come to know your own senses, because knowing them outwardly would also lead to beginning to know them inwardly. So you would, in a dream one night, say, how am I seeing this, or how am I hearing this? Like if a seer spoke some words to you at the edge of deep sleep, just before you left dream, or as you came back out of deep sleep, you came into higher dream, and you had a very prophetic vision. How was it, or was it that I was seeing that or hearing that? And so these are all kind of the subtle dynamics of consciousness and the way it shifts from state to state, so that to become a knower of Brahman is said that then you'll put these internal and the external together and connect them, and never feel disjointed, no matter where you are, in what body you're in, what world you're in, what state of consciousness you're in. You're always feeling that one commonality, if you will, and that's running through all of those things, which, as we started off the class saying, is the underlying essence in all things. Chairs, rugs, houses, sky, stars, suns, so forth. So prana would be that way in which you would connect to these subtler things. There's a prana in the mind then that's called psychic prana, and a prana in the body, which is gross, a prana in the senses, which is subtler, and then the subtlest most prana, almost a causal prana, in the mind with its thoughts and its dreams. A lot could be said about that. We've said it before, but right now we're trying to look through this to get a comparison with Shankara's additions to yoga when he took it up and did his samyama on it in 700 AD. After pranayama, getting the energy under control, then pratyahara. You can withdraw your mind from external and internal things. External objects, I can be done with them, or take them or leave them. And thoughts, I can also control them and master them. If I don't want to think a certain way, I don't have to. If there's some song in my mind that keeps recurring and I don't want to hear it anymore, I can turn it off. I've had people come up and tell me that. Oh, I've got this jingle in my mind, or this song that's just always there, and I wake up with it and I fall asleep, it won't leave me alone. So they haven't put their finger on the on-off switch yet of that little personal CD player in there. And being able to switch off any thought or anything that happens to occur to the mind, which would be a perfect mastery of the mind. So pratyahara is a very key place, and there you see it's right there at fifth, so there's 4 stages before it and 3 after it. So pratyahara is a pivotal place where if you can master the mind's attachment to external and internal thoughts, that you can then concentrate, and that's the 5th state, dharana, and 6th state's dhyan, meditation, and the 7th state is dhyan, and the 8th state is samadhi. So that's how Father of Yoga put together his beautiful Ashtanga, 8-limbed, or Patanjala, or Raja Yoga system. Around 140 AD, they say. And then 600 years later, as I was saying, appeared in the body again to teach Shankara and to apprentice Gaudapada. Again, showing how close the yoga is, if not exact, with Advaita Vedanta, because Gaudapada's main teachings were around Advaita Vedanta. And all 3 of these were Shaivites in that incarnation. See? So they were worshippers of Shiva, they worshipped Divine Mother. Gaudapada even wrote a scripture on Divine Mother. And Shankara wrote songs on Divine Mother. So you see Shiva and Shakti, the tantric element, in all 3 of them. And then you see this Advaita Vedanta in all 3 of them. And then you see this yoga in all 3 of them. So there are these beautiful hidden triputis in everything that are even deeper than the traditional triputis that you hear about, like Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, or A, U, and M of Om, and so forth. So let's look side by side then. And when it comes to the yamas and niyamas, you see the 5 practices that I put up here. If I go there right now and show you them again, we won't get to finish this chart today, so I want to move on, but they're there for you to look at if you look back on this live streaming as a recording, or past teachings. We've been through them a lot, so you pretty much know what they're like. I've shown this chart several times before in our history. But to go on, this side is Shankara's Advaita Yoga in 15 parts. This side was Patanjali's 8-limbed yoga. Again, teacher-student in that particular lifetime. Hoary old sage and 12-year-old young man, or maybe he was older than 12 at that time, but he was still a young teenager, just like Jesus when he left home. So there you see his definition of the yamas is seeing all as Brahman. So if you were to quickly refer to here, you'd know the yamas are non-violence, truthfulness, non-coveting, continence, and non-receiving of gifts. So if those are the 5 yamas, and we just quickly consider those, then you can see that seeing all as Brahman would be the Advaita Yoga. Look at that. Shankara's, if he's commenting on his teacher's system of 500 years ago, say, or 600 years ago, he would say, how would I put that in Advaitic terms? See, all of this is doing all of this, seeing it all as Brahman. So that's how he's bringing in the non-dual thread into a practice-oriented yoga. The first limb being 5 parts. These are called observances here, and the niyamas are called practices. So observances and practices are penultimate to the other 6 limbs of yoga. And niyamas, he calls it control of mind. So he puts together seeing all as Brahman, and if you do these kinds of practices, then you'll know that how much you're lacking in certain things, abilities. You might have mastered nonviolence and truthfulness, but you might have a problem with coveting the goods of others, or jealousy, or the passions might get in there and trip you up once in a while. So you want to completely master these things. In the case of niyamas, you can see here there are purity of mind, contentedness, devotion to God, scriptural study, and austerity. So those 10 are the first 2 limbs of Patanjali's yoga. He calls them seeing all as Brahman and control of the mind. So to him, if you were to practice purity of mind, contentedness, devotion to God, scriptural study, and austerity, that would be consummate with or tantamount to control of the mind. That's even before you get to pratyahara, right? Down here. So you're doing a kind of requisite pratyahara already up here that's going to settle you into mastering the deeper pranayama and pratyahara down here, if he's calling it control of the mind. So you can see where Advaita Vedanta is going to start at a very high level of expectation of you as a practitioner, which is one of the reasons why we don't like to see people jumping to Advaita Vedanta before they've satisfied certain requisites in their practice, like sitting in asana and meditating on the formless reality. To me, in my look at the Western culture over the last 40 years as a Dharma teacher, I'm not seeing that that's very healthy in many cases, unless these few singular rare cases are beings that had already come into incarnation with their mind pretty much under control, which always has to be allowed for. But for the main part, a lot of falling down and failing and quitting the path and leaving one guru for another and giving up one mantra and taking another, and on, the problems that are rampant right now and pretty much broadcast over the whole culture, no matter where you look, no matter who says it. So, and a lot of posturing and pretense too, in the form of beings who are presuming to teach, who have not satisfied these requisites yet, have not done many, many years of practice, maybe who are not even still doing practice, even if they say they have enlightenment, because the great seers kept up their practice after they gained so-called enlightenment. Even the highest of enlightenment, like Nirvikalpa Samadhi, come back down from that, you see, and be a blessing to those around you, without even calling yourself a blessing or knowing that you're a blessing, like Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Why is that? Because the ego had vanished long ago. He was just Divine Mother's puppet. She's got like a bunch of sticks tied together with strings, like children might make a puppet out of sticks, with strings, operate it. He saw that once. He said, "I'm just like that, the Divine Mother. I'm her little string puppet. You see, she moves me here and there, and does with me what she will. Shakale tomari icha." "Oh Mother, by your will everything happens." It's one of his favorite songs. One of his favorite bhajans in India. So those two are how Shankara would comment quickly on the 5 yamas and 5 niyamas. Then here's where he departs from the next limb would be asana. Before asana even comes along, which is here, he's added in four other elements here. Interesting that in yoga he says renunciation should come first, then mauna, silence, and that's where the doorways to yoga start, and then desha, space of consciousness, mastering the space of consciousness, that he wants you to know that there are different kinds of space, not just the physical space. And probably you wouldn't know that there are other kinds of space until you renounce this space. So if you're so attached to this space, material objects and the senses, then you're courting this brooding mind that's going to go down the doorways, not up the doorways of yoga, but down the descending steps to the cold basement of forgetfulness. It's very likely that you're headed in that direction or are risking that fall. So renounce all of this first, and then other subtler levels of space will begin to suggest themselves to you. And what I'm thinking right now is non-receiving of gifts. If you renounce that, receiving and giving of gifts, or any of the import that most people attach to it, making money, owning things, possessing things, all the things that are the problems to neglecting Brahman, then you will immediately start having these experiences of previous lifetimes or of higher space, like the space you were in last night in deep sleep, are like the space that you knew about before you were born, or the space that you went into at the end of your last lifetime when you passed from the body. All of those kinds of spaces, bardo as the Buddhists call it, will suggest themselves to you. Maybe not in the way that most people think about them, like, oh, I'm actually seeing my past lifetime. But as I'm saying, Advaitically, they'll be a part of you again. It's just a natural way of tying it all together or bringing it all forward. I don't know how else to say it. It's your natural state of consciousness contains all of that. Because you've mastered the mind, it's all in the mind, so you can see the mind that contains it. And the seeds also are there for it. People talk a lot about when they talk about the word akasha, space in Sanskrit, they leave out all the most important connotations and talk about the historic record of akasha. And they say, oh, what happened here and then as sort of a historic record, well, we can look back and see the events of time. And usually people who want to do that psychically are people who want to go back and see if things that are recorded in history were really true or not. The whole point being that none of it was ever true. Only Brahman is true. And you're not seeing that when you get involved in phenomena, just like you're not seeing your true self in your past lifetimes when you're involved in money making. So missing the pointism is a major attainment for most people, and it's ruining their attainment of higher spiritual fruits. And so must be said about that. Two things then, those things to say about renunciation, silence, and space of consciousness. He's adding those in as important qualities that probably were suggested by Govindapada here. So he probably means that when he's talking about non-receiving. He probably means that silence when he's talking about purity of mind, contentedness, you see. These things are inferred. But Shankara is bringing them out 700, 600 years later for the people of the times to help fill in the gaps that have occurred over the past 500 or 600 years since he came along, father of yoga, as Patanjali, and laid down that beautiful eight-limb system that was very much influenced by Lord Buddha and his Eightfold Path and Four Noble Truths. Whole thing being one line again. That's why I'm trying to show it as Buddhism, Patanjala, and Advaita Vedanta according to Shankara. All evenly spaced apart, and just like 3 steps of the Mahashakti. See, every time she put her foot down, there was a great seer to help explain the footfall, and then there was the system that came from it, from the actual footfall itself. And then someone to come after, like some of the disciples of Shankara. I mean, if you talk about the senses, for instance, and control of the senses, then they put them in so many ways. They sang about them in so many ways. For instance, in Shankara's way, he would put Punarapi Jananam, Punarapi Maranam, Punarapi Janani Jatare Shayanam, Iha Samsare Bahudishtare, Kripaya Pare Pahi Rumare, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam Mudamate, Samprapte Sanihite Kale, Nahi Nahi Rakshati Dukrin Kaline. This was Shankara's student, Nityananda. And he says, repeated births, repeated deaths, repeated occupation in various wombs. This transmigratory process is difficult indeed to cross. Therefore, this one cries out, save me, to the august destroyer of demons, who would be Shiva, or Shankara. So his student, Nityananda, sang this beautiful verse about transmigratory process and this risk of falling into brooding on sense objects and considering the world to be real, all the things that Shankara came to destroy, destroyer of demons. So demons are not horned beings with tails and pitchforks and wrathful deities and so forth, so much as they are what's occupying the mind and keeping you from realizing your true nature. And so we would sing like that. Now, if you looked at someone else's, another one of Shankara's disciples was named Hasta Amalaka, which means holder of the fruit in the palm of the hand. Holder of the fruit of realization in the very palm of his hand. So, Hasta Amalaka, holder of fruit of, this fruit would be spiritual realization in the palm of his hand so he could see it at any time. He would sing about that in this way. Manas chakshuradir vimukta svayam yo. Manas chakshuradir Manas chakshuradir agamya swarupaha Sanichopalabdis swarupahamatmam. He says, even bereft of sense experience, mental cognition, and vital functions, that internal reality continues to exist, relying upon nothing. It is that which animates the senses, impels the life force, and awakens the mind. That perpetual being am I, self-effulgent, illuminating the entire cosmos. So he says, that Brahman, that one non-dual entity, which is my very self, it illumines the cosmos, it animates the senses, it impels my life force to flow, it awakens my mind, and even if I'm bereft of sense experiences, thoughts, and vital functions, it still continues to exist. So, Hasta Amalaka, one of Shankara's students. He was the man, actually the young boy, not much younger than this when Shankara met him, who hadn't spoken for most of the years of his life. And his father, he was a Brahmin, so he was supposed to be a priest, and he would earn his keep and his living by speaking, so he wouldn't talk. They thought there was something wrong with him, but he was just, his whole first early years of his life did not speak a word. The first words Shankara spoke to him when he came to his village, and his father brought him to him, said, "This boy cannot talk, can you heal him?" Shankara said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm not a human." First words he spoke in that whole, since his whole silence when he was a young man, "I'm not a human, a god, I'm not a being inhabiting celestial realms, neither am I a priest, a warrior, a merchant, or a worker." 4 castes that he was born into. He was born as a priest. "And I'm neither monk, householder, hermit, nor wanderer." 4 types of living. "I am the ever-conscious eternal self, infinite and pervading everything." So he knew this from early on, you see, when he was born with a pure mind, and didn't speak about it. Isn't that what he was told to do by everyone from Holy Mother, right on down to his own teacher? Silence is the doorway to yoga, see? And then he finally found someone worth speaking to, evidently. Shankara said, "Who are you, boy?" "Well, I'm not this, I'm not that." So it was neti neti out of his mouth the first words he spoke. "I'm none of those things that people attribute to me. I'm certainly not a Brahmin priest." See? So I don't want to earn money by doing rituals and so forth. So he was a very rare higher cut. So there you have 2 of Shankara's disciples singing about the senses, the body, and the transmigratory process. Do you want some further instance? Here's Shankara himself then singing this. Om mano bhunjahamkara chitani naham nacha shrotra jiyuve nacha gra Nachavyoma bhumir Natejas navayu Chidananda rupaha Shivoham Shivoham Chidananda rupaha Shivoham Shivoham. So the first of 6 verses on Nirvana, called Nirvana Shatkam by Shankara, who he must have sung those for his students, whose verses I just sung prior to that. So he says, I'm Mano Buddha Hamkara Chittani. First 4 words are the Hamkara, right? So he's not starting at I'm the body. He says, I'm not the mind. I'm not the fourfold mind. You see? Control the mind automatically out the gate. There's no talk of asana or pranayama or any of those things yet, you see. And this will only be for practitioners or for teachers who want to teach these things. They may have to familiarize themselves with them. I never saw my teacher sit in an asana or do a breathing exercise. In fact, I didn't see any of my teachers do that. They were perfected minds. They were pure minds. They were free souls. Even my Western teacher, if he could be called that, Lex Hickson, my mentor, my compatriot, I didn't see him doing asana. I'd see him come into the shrine room, sit like this, and go into meditation. I hear him talk about discourses and so forth and so forth. I didn't see him sitting there doing breathing exercises while I meditated. So these souls are souls that come to show the highest truth, and along the way, if they find that you have some sort of impediment, they can use the tools of yoga to help you break through those impediments. That must be something to be seen. So the integrity of the aspirant is very important. If there are things in the way, you can't pretend them away and you can't jump steps. You must take them up and tackle them, face them off, and do the practice that will untie the knot called granti in your body, in your prana, in your mind, in your thought, your thinking process, and also in your ego, to untie those grantis. There, then, on the spot, with your teacher present, and with all the guidance you need to get yourself free. So, setting you up for all this, you see, when he's moving through these great teachings. So, he says, I'm neither mind, intelligence, ego, or thought. I am not eyes, tongue, senses of smell or sight. I am not ether, air, fire, water, or earth. What am I then? Chidananda rupaha shivaham. I'm Shiva, and Shiva is pure consciousness and unalloyed, uninterrupted bliss of pure being, not becoming, being. So this is the Advaita yoga. This is the look at yoga, even as a practice. Even if you do the practice, you're doing it as seeing it all as Brahman, right? The very first thing. You don't get all tied up with the yamas and say, oh, maybe I should be better at this and better at that. You see it all as Brahman and then enter into it. And it's always been the rule of thumb. It's called Advaita Vedanta Sadhana. For those few who are called to that path, which is the most rarefied and elevated path of all, the only criterion you have to satisfy to enter into it is being able to do that. And if anything is railing against that or keeping you from it, you need to take it to task, and that's where you go to yoga. So even Shankara will present to you, but he's presenting to you things that are non-physical and not even very much related with the prana, are they? They're pretty much about your mind, renouncing with your mind, keeping silent mind, peaceful mind, and knowing the space of consciousness inside of you. Not the space of objects, knowing the space that objects sit in. See? And not just the physical objects either. Your thoughts are objects, they're sitting in a subtle space too. See? So if you can look at inside, see in deep sleep, and you see there's seeds there. You see, the seeds are sitting in a space of consciousness. that space of consciousness is the point. The seeds themselves are like eggs of an alien, you see. It just occurred to me. Lots of eggs of the alien, you see. Shall I crack one of those? Get grabbed by the throat, you see? No, I want to know the space around it, you see, so I know where these seeds sit, how to not disturb them as I proceed quietly around them to get to samadhi. See? And that's my task. That's my test, and should be my triumph in the end. So these four things and one other, kala, time. So he adds pretty much space, time in here, doesn't he? And renunciation, before he gets to where his teacher in another lifetime, father of yoga, jumped to asana. So these four need to be meditated on as Advaita yoga, four more parts of the eight-limb system if you want to bring the eight-limb system current into Advaita Vedanta context. Now he goes on and he gets to asana, and what's he call it? Posture of meditation. So how could he put it in a few words, and how can we then put it in English in a few words? 3 beautiful words that won't mislead us into thinking that maybe asana is going to get us enlightened, or maybe it's going to heal our diseases, or maybe it's going to open up some pituitary glands or some strange things in us that are going to give us miraculous healing powers. No, it's the posture of meditation, because meditation goes with renunciation, see, and meditation on space and time goes with transcendental meditation. You want to go beyond space and time. Everyone who's bound is bound in space and time. And you want to get beyond them, say like, maybe Shiva. See, Chidananda Rupaha Shivaham Shivaham. He's called Trikaladarshi, the master of the 3 phases of time. And AUM, the master of the 3 levels of consciousness, master of those 2. So there's all these triputis which Shiva has. He's got a trident, right? It's 3-pronged. So you've got basically gross, subtle, and causal worlds. He's master of those. So you see all these important triputis attending Shiva. He doesn't attend them, they attend upon him. And so he's aptakama, he's free of desire for them. And of course, desire is what happens along the road of brooding, the fall of brooding. So you can see he's not brooding on them, he's master of them. They can even get some sort of transcendental bliss and humor out of watching them, you see, just watching the wheels turn. And waiting for a few people to turn to the top to get out, and he can help them. So important to see he calls this, that is Shankara's, adding in a 5th element to these 8-limbed yoga at this place, calling it posture of meditation. So he wants you in ekasana like this. If you need to do a few physical asanas, like virasana or any other asana, that there's 4 or 5 that are recommended by Divine Mother Scriptures that are better than the others, in order to get you into this posture, then that's okay. It might take you a month or 2 to practice those until you can finally sit like this without a problem. And a guide is good for that. But you have to also be aware that when you get into a position like this, you're committing yourself to yoga. That's one thing that could be said about a physical position like this, is that when you spread the legs in this tripod position, you're opening the base of the spine, even physically. But not just physically, you're also opening it up to the potential of Kundalini beginning to rise in you, called Udgata first, which is just a precursor, a testing to Kundalini. Some people mistake that for Kundalini and then run afoul of the system. But if they have a guide that shows them how to work with that energy that's mounting, and eating food with mantra, pure food and so forth, and doing certain elements that aren't usually taught, except maybe in Tantra or in yoga, then this energy, when it comes up, will be pure. It won't cause problems. There's on record people of bringing up the Kundalini that still had impurities in that Udgata, and then having torturous experiences instead of having blissful experiences, which it's really more about. Being very disoriented at high levels, not being stable, like a candle in a windowless place. See, and these things you have to discern when you take to the practice and read the scriptures and have a teacher. You have to discern these things and practice discrimination. All right, so then he's still adding in. So he goes traditional, then neo, traditional again, and then neo. See, so now he adds in 3 others that are not in Patanjali's original system. First is Nirodha. With Nirodha, he restrains Maya by Brahman. Good luck restraining Maya any other way. That's all I have to say. If you want to restrain Maya by Brahman, that is, you might say by concentrating on Brahman, Maya goes away. No other way. If you concentrate upon Maya, it's going to be very difficult. That's why Sri Ramakrishna said, never study Maya up close. Study it from a distance. And I think, myself, that that's what science is doing. They're studying Maya up close. By taking matter and splitting it into atoms and so forth, and looking at all of its particles, just leading them into more and more particles that finally you're changing at a billionth of a second, you're studying something that's not real. And if you don't come to the right conclusion at the end of that, because the Buddhists and earlier Hindus did the same thing with this electron microscope of the eye, they looked inside and they looked outside, and when they looked at matter, they saw that it was vibrating particles that came from sound. That is special sound, which is one of the reasons why you practice the doorway of yoga by connecting the word to the mind, sound. It's a whole teaching in itself that gets overlooked quite a lot. It's a little bit more tantric, so it's not quite as prominent in the Vedanta of the day. But if you're interested in that, as I was, say as a musician, then, and the divinity of the sound too, how words contain great power for transforming people, to waking them up, not just hypnotizing them, then you can pull that power out and use it for great good, for yourself and for others. And that's what Dharma is about, and so forth. So, back to the point here, restraining Maya by Maya is what most people are trying to do, maybe even without knowing they're trying to do it. I think the key there is you have to all of a sudden perceive the presence of Maya. And most people don't. People aren't walking around saying, oh, this is an appearance. See, they're not born with that. It's only a very rare soul that all of a sudden says, I'm not really happy here, I don't like this, this is strange, all these shapes, this feels limiting, I'm not comfortable here, I'm not really happy in this body. Whatever it is that comes to you in the form of something that might lead you to brooding depression later. If a teacher gets a hold of you, if you get a hold of a teacher at that early stage, then they can show you that that's a positive thing, and that you may be of a higher class of soul that's done with this world weary, you see, and that's a positive thing to them. You have to understand this about the seers. They've renounced the world early on, and it's no more in them. You see. So the fact that they have to come into the world is a problem to help save you. So that they're willing to do in some cases. And they'll do that via various mechanisms like words and teachings and Dharma and so forth. Helping you meditate. So probably enough can't be said about this, but Nirodha, when you hear the word, who do you think of? This is Shankara using it. Who do you think of when you usually hear the word Nirodha? Patanjali, the father of yoga. Nirodha, he used both of them in the teachings. And it can be the fifth state of mind, can't it? Where everything goes empty, everything goes formless, transcendent. after ekagra, one-pointed, then there's no mind. Sort of like they sometimes describe the lowest state of mind as zigzag like this. Most people's mind going up like that. And then they call the second state of mind is depressed, so it's like a valley. It's all sign language, S-I-N-E, It's all by measurement, you see. Then the third level of mind is flat for a while, an arc, flat for a while, a valley, flat, a peak, flat, a valley. And that's a mind that's sattvic sometimes, and then it's all of a sudden elated, and then it's all of a sudden depressed. And it cannot keep itself steady without those peaks and valleys. Sound familiar? Most people. Then there's ekagra, fourth state of mind. This is the 5 state of minds by who? Patanjali, the father of yoga, one of his teachings in the yoga system. The 5 states of mind is very beautiful. The 4th state of mind is ekagra, which is like a flat line. In medical terms, you've died, you see. So spiritual medical terms, you're at the highest hospital possible, and they're trying to measure your sine wave, and you're dead. So you're not thinking anymore. Your mind's controlled. You don't have any peaks and valleys, no jagged. And that's a good place to be, you see. But then there's the 5th state of mind, which is nirodha they call it, which is a line and then a space, a line and then a space, a line and then a space. So that mind is disappearing. It's not just even anymore and equanimous. It's a very good state to be at. You want to attain that. But it's actually disappearing completely at certain times. Sort of like deep sleep last night for you. And then the line comes back and you're balanced again. Then you disappear. It's like the disappearance of the ego at first, and then pretty soon, maybe you could say there might be a 6th state of mind where there's just no line anymore. It's all space. Which is why you mastered space back here, you see, to know about this. So this is some extra information about restraint of Maya by Brahman. You must know yourself as Brahman, see all as Brahman, and then restrain Maya by Brahman. Otherwise, the ego can't do it for you. See, and you haven't you're investing everything in the ego. Well, can you do this for me? Sure, I can, it says. It bloats itself up, fails again and again, then gets depressed and maybe goes rolling down the Negligence of Brahman staircase, you see. And then where does that leave you? See, when your ego fails you. So, this is where Advaita Vedanta adds the original element that Patanjali intended into Ashtanga Yoga. This is not just a practice. This is what he meant. And he had to have Shankara come back to tell people that's what he meant. What else is a good student for? Not explaining the teachings of the teacher. So then you have Deha Samatva. Almost sounds 8-fold path, doesn't it? Deha Samatva, very close to an 8-fold path of Lord Buddha. It's called Ashtanga Marga. This is called Ashtanga Yoga. Buddha's path, which was, again, another 700 years or so before Patanjali. The Ashtanga Marga was the 8-fold path, which is the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths, you see. So there you see, he calls it equipoise of the body. Remember what Patanjali called it? Anga, Me, Jayatva, Shvasha, Prashvashaha. He had these big 7-8 syllable words, Sanskrit words for resting the limbs properly, or being unable to rest the limbs properly. That was such a problem for some people that even mountain yogis went out, created a stick, carved a stick, put a little hoop in it, and rested their arms on it and sat like that on 2 of them. Now maybe my arms will be safe, fine. But if you have a right mudra, like if you ever want to see it, look in Swami Vivekananda's famous meditation picture, and you'll see that he's got the right hand to the left hand, and he's just resting his hands in his lap like this in this meditation mudra. His wrists are kind of on his thighs there. Of course, people's bodies are a little different shape, But you can see that he's got that nestled right there, so it's not pulling on the shoulders and it's not pulling the elbows out, and it's got a support, and then he just closes his eyes and looks down the tip of his nose into the heart. When you're looking down the tip of the nose doesn't mean you're looking at the tip of the nose. That's silly. What's the nose got to do with anything? The occultists might want to find out what smells are like, so they concentrate there. See what's the nature of smell. But the real thing is to look down the bridge of the nose into the heart chakra. And if you're in that position, then you won't have any anga mejayatva. That is uncomfortable nature of the limbs, where to put them, you see. So that's part of one of the things that's the deha samatva, equipoise of the body. And of course, then you also have to find the same position for shoulders, neck, and chin. You see, there's a teaching in Tibetan Buddhism called samatha. That's a teaching of, they call it the burning pillar meditation. And so it has 6 different things you do with it's sort of a little bit like Kundalini yoga, but it's more specifically how to treat the body in meditation so that your mind can get into meditation. And like you feel like you're tucking in the corners of a nicely made bed by the time you rise to the 5th and 6th practice. Like one of them is attaching the tip of the tongue to the roof of the mouth, and then pulling the chin back in just a little bit, so that it's not, putting pressure on the spine this way. See, so natural S curve, and it gets up there to the neck, and the chin is tucked a little bit. They call that like a vulture. See. And then I'll touch the tip of the tongue, the mouth. If you've done this, all of a sudden you just go into meditation naturally. And the burning pillar implication is that you shine with light. Well, first you burn with suffering. The burning pillar starts out, you sweat. You see, the novice gets into this position, and it's so powerful that he starts to sweat and burn. And he has to hold this position for a certain time. But as he masters each of these things purify, each of these centers purify, all of a sudden now he feels like, oh, I'm getting very light and buoyant right now. I'm feeling very good, you see, and bliss is coming. Then he starts burning with light of enlightenment to light up all the worlds. Isn't that what Hastam Malaka just sang to us? I am the light of all the worlds now. Isn't that what Jesus said when he came out of the wilderness? I am the light of the worlds. So he burns with that kind of light. Dridatta drishya. Whenever you hear that word drish or dri, it talks about seeing, particularly an inner kind of seeing or inner vision. So it's firmness of vision that he's adding in there. All of these 3, I'm calling them neo or more current additions to the 8-limbed yoga that Shankara put in, are prior to pranayama. So these 4 were prior to asana. These 3 are prior to pranayama. So he's put in 7 things here now in the first 4 limbs of yoga. By the time Patanjali had arrived there in his system, Shankara has already added 7 other concomitants into the system. So, and there they are. We looked at 2 of them. This last one is firmness of vision. And so you must know your Brahman at all times, under all circumstances. You might say that. And even in the most pressing circumstances, when others doubt you in various ways, or when you're persecuted, as Jesus said, then you should still keep your faith totally in the self, the great self within you. Because all these other beings, that's what they've done. They are the great self. And so you must assume that position. If you talk about an asana to assume, I am Atma Brahma asana would be that, you see. I am Atma Brahma is one of the great sayings. Put asana after it. It means you're taking the mental position of I am Brahman, or this self is Brahman. Prajnanam Brahma. So he's making sure along the way that this is what you're attaining and keeping, because you've just been through a period of restraining Maya by Brahman, and you've just tried to deal with the body. So if these are coming back on you, they could come back with some ill effects, even some subtle residue. See? So this is how closely they inspect you, or you should inspect yourself as you practice yoga, true yoga, and adhering always to Advaita yoga as you do so. All right, so enough said about those. Pranayam he calls mental states as Brahman. Might as well be saying that as I take the in-breath, as Patanjali said, and I hold the breath and I expel the breath, that's called Puraka, Kumbhaka, and Rechaka. There are whole teachings in yoga about that should not be pulled out of the eight-limb context and just taught as a breathing exercise. It should be left inside the context of yoga and thought of as being in Brahman. Because that's the problem with doing a practice where you forget yourself. You're not doing a practice to create a new self or even to save your old self. You're doing it to remember your true self. And that should always be the way it is, even if you think you've fallen away into darkness. Is that yourself is always in light. I am always in light. It's one of the lines of the song, you see. So that's a mental asana that you must keep. That's why he has you firmness of vision, see. And so mental states as Brahman. And in case you should fall away into thinking that firmness of vision has anything to do with my ego, or anything to do with anything other than Brahman, that I should remember to remind myself that these mental states themselves are done as Brahman, are realized as Brahman, are there in Brahman. See, so my mind has a pure place to go at every level of its thinking process and beyond thinking. As this energy rises up, it's encountering space of consciousness every time in a more subtler way. It's just more subtle until it's finally causal, until it's finally transcendental. And that's the way they think of all the worlds: gross, subtle, causal, and ultimate or transcendental. A-U-M and Turiya of the word. Which we will look at next week, by the way. I'll show you this new chart, or the facelift that this chart got, about, you see the beauty of it, where Christ and Krishna are put together, and the twin waterfalls here in Hawaii, and you look at the four states of the word, how the word attends upon you the whole way, from the beginning stages to the ultimate stages, or if you will, from para all the way down to Madhyama and to Vaikari, and then back to para. Like Sri Ramakrishna is saying, my most mature opinion is that the soul starts at the Nitya, the eternal, and falls into the Leela, takes a form and plays, and then goes back, sports in the fields of the Lord, and then returns to the Nitya at the end of the play, without holding on to anything, and can do this up and down, sort of like Shankara was saying about attaining and attaching and detaching at will. See? So that pretty soon, entering the realms of name and form or not is the same thing. It doesn't make no never mind, as they say, to the soul, which is beyond space and time. It can dream itself and play into any form it wants without leaving its original position, which is the secret of great souls. See, Ishvara. He's coming to that. So, mental states as Brahman is a beautiful thing, and this is part of what inspired me to write that book recently called Manasana, or is that what it's called? Right? Manasana, the mental states as Brahman. That different states you can take that can heal you, or that can transform you, and that are transcendental at the same time. And so you take up certain ones as per your daily practice. Sort of like taking up the 5 moods of Vaishnavism and being and mastering one of them. In this way you can take up a certain mental asana that will heal you of something you know that's in you. Or you can take up a certain mental asana that will grant you the attainment of a spiritual quality that you covet, that you see, that you've seen in others, and the seers that you want to attain. So these are asanas, mental asanas, manasanas. And of course they're much, much deeper and higher than just asana as a physical exercise. Well, there he has added in those three, but then he leaves the rest the same. So straight across the board you see pranayam, but he calls it mental states of Brahman. In the case of pratyahara, where you're trying to master the inner and outer thoughts of the mind, he calls it seeing Atman in everything. So if you're practicing classical pratyahara, you think, well, I must first renounce all this, not get attached to it in my meditation, right? Can't think about food. Dinner's an hour away. I've got to meditate with not thought about food, you see. Going swimming tomorrow at the beach. No, I can't think about that. See, so anything that the mind wants to go to, you have to put it out for that period of meditation. And then you find out that inside also there are things that you're attached to, that you want to not be attached to, at least for the duration of your meditation, so you can practice emptiness, if you will, and see what that's like. See what the peace of nothingness is like. The peace that passes all understanding, Jesus called it. Because understanding has something to do with the mind, right? And that's good, to understand something. But what about that which is never in need of understanding anymore? It doesn't need to understand because it's the essence itself. It is itself, resting in its own essence. I feel like Lexington right now, because he was always saying things like this. So, seeing Atman in everything is the name that Shankara gave to Govindapada's system 500 years earlier as Patanjali, called pratyahara, which usually is restraining the waves of the mind going towards objects, both inner and outer, pratyahara. It's what people can't master, so they can't really concentrate and meditate. They can concentrate and meditate when their mind balances out, but not at other times. That's when the guna of sattva comes. Oh, I'm a great meditator today. I must be enlightened. A couple days or a week later, they've fallen on hard times, see. Their mind's confused, unhappy, so forth. You know the drill, they say. So, to really master pratyahara once and for all time, then would be, seeing Atman in all would be the helper. Then dharana, concentration, dhyan, meditation, and samadhi. What to call samadhi in English, non-dual being, or satchitananda, or nirvikalpa. Take your pick. Kind of ultimate samadhis that are non-dual. One samadhi that's non-dual, that has different names. In yoga, asampragyata, seedless. In Buddhism, nirvana, all the vibrations made extinct, nirvana, made extinct. And then in here, calling it nirvikalpa samadhi, or Advaita Vedanta, if you will. So that was a half-time, 1/2 length class on this beautiful chart, where I was saying at the break, I was so happy to see some artist put together this very esoteric story about Patanjali's incarnation as Govindapada some 600 years after he composed the 8-limb system, and then appearing as Govindapada as Shankara's teacher. And this young lad, you can see how young he is here coming into the cave, that somebody had actually put together an image like that when they read that story. Because it's not known very much, even in India, that connection. So beautiful that we were able to go through all that. There is one quote at the bottom here we can end with, where Shankara says, "Attain samadhi by controlling the senses, and remain always in peace. By attaining samadhi, destroy the darkness that arises from ignorance by the practice of seeing oneness always and everywhere. These are the main doorways to yoga," as we look back on that, because that's where we bounced from. Then control speech and mind, give up all expectations and all desires, and seek solitude. So again, if this sounds too ascetic or too monastic to this culture that we're speaking to mainly today and to this time, this space and time, you must see it inside of the perspective of your own life. Cut out time for doing these very things. And no halfway measures about it. Oh, I think I'll be silent for an hour in the next room while my husband goes on doing what they do outside, or things are going on around me. No, you have to take this and be a yogi in a cave, as it were, wherever that cave is for you. Could even be the cave of your heart, which is a very good cave to go into if you can find it. And be very serious about that kind of seclusion, that kind of solitude, that kind of renunciation from a world that's ultimately unreal. So here, let's end with the chant. Om Tachnayo, Om Tachnayo Ravrini Mahe, Gatung Yagyaya, Gatung Yenupataye, Daivi Swastrastu Naha, Swastir Manusebyaha, Urdvam Jagatu Bhesajam, Samnavastu Dvipade Sang Chatushpate, Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May we make a complete and sincere offering of the small self into the great self. May we always revere the mother of all sacrifices and the Lord of all sacrifices. May divine blessings be upon us. May peace come into the entire human race. May healing, well-being, and prosperity then also abide among us. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om.